Matt and Corie Weathers here. We are so excited to join you as you are being trained with the Red Cross on working with military families. We are a military family. Matt is an active duty Army chaplain, and we like to be able to share a little bit of our story as a military family and what it's like to serve military families. And so during this video, we're going to be unpacking a little bit of our story and what we've noticed in working with other military families as they've gone through deployments and reintegration. So just to start off and introduce ourselves just a little bit, my name is Corie. I am a licensed professional counselor, and I serve specifically with military and first responder couples and do a lot of work with military spouses for sure. And so Matt is an active duty chaplain. He's been in for, 10 years now?
10 years.
10 years. When we first started off, we didn't know that we were going to be a military family. We first got married. And then that was just been the calling on our life and something that we have thoroughly enjoyed. So we've been stationed all over the place. Colorado to start.
Colorado, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, back to South Carolina.
Yeah, and then we're looking at a Kansas move as well. So we have two boys. They are 10 and 13. They're approaching birthdays as well, and so it's been an interesting experience. So we hope to also share with you a little bit of what it's like for kids to go through the military experience, especially as it relates to deployment and reintegration.
Right. So our family's been through two deployments in 2009 and 10, and then again in 2012 and 2013. So our boys were about 2 and 5, and then about 5 and 8 during those two deployments, and the second one was a little bit shorter. And some of those deployments, actually, the way that deployments are right now, it's changing. So what we knew back then to be reality is constantly in flux and constantly changing. So we not only, as a chaplain family, have the lessons learned of going through it in the process and what we lived through, but also on how we helped others, and whether that was a part of being co-leaders, co-teachers for marriage retreats, helping out in chapel, or Corie being a licensed professional counselor in a local environment, talking with military spouses and service members and families, or myself being able to provide counsel for my soldiers and their family members as well. So we lived through it and then helped other people live through it. So we've definitely got some experience and wisdom that we're hoping that we can just share and then edify you in your practice.
So a lot of you are professionals and volunteers that are going to be working with military families, working with families perhaps in a variety of settings. Some of you are professionals working in your career, perhaps in the mental health field, working with military families. Some of you might be just volunteers that are, I don't want to say just volunteers because we are so thankful for all the volunteering that you offer. But perhaps you're doing that on the side of your career and serving military families. Either way, we hope that some of the things that we can share with you today will help you to feel more confident and more equipped to working with military families, and some of the unique things that you'll see from them, sometimes subtle dynamics that are happening in those families that are sometimes hard to read or discern, and maybe give you a little bit of an inside look as to what some of these families might be going through, but maybe not sharing. So our first deployment that we went through, Matt was in Afghanistan. It was a year-long deployment. That was our first experience as a military family, our first assignment, our first duty station as well. And our experience of that deployment we thought was the normal military Army experience. And it turns out that it was a lot more intense than what the typical military family goes through. But I think that as we share with you a little bit of our experience of that will give you a perspective on what some of the families may have gone through, and perhaps not, but either way prepares you a little bit more for some of the more intense situations.
Okay.
So our first deployment was in 2009. Matt went off to Afghanistan. Our first experience as a family being really apart the way that we were. Like I said, this deployment was a little bit more intense, a lot more intense than a lot of families go through, but definitely more intense than we have ever experienced before and what we've experienced since then. During the deployment, I served as a care team coordinator, and basically what that is I served as the volunteer that would find the other military spouse volunteers that would serve a family if they were notified that their soldier was killed in action. We lost many, many soldiers during that deployment. deployment. 8 in particular were lost during one battle that we've had 2 Medal of Honors have come out of that battle, and many awards on top of that. For those of you who may not be aware of the award system, I know I wasn't coming into the military. The Medal of Honor is the highest award given to a service member for heroic actions, and it's presented by the president. And so this was a huge event for us as a couple, a huge event for us as a unit. And what we noticed during a deployment that was a year long was that our time apart changed us in ways that we had no idea really what had changed in us separately until we were back together, reintegrated, and really getting to experience that on a daily basis. So for me, what that did for me during an entire year, where really we're only able to talk on the phone, maybe a little bit of Skyping was going on. And I know a lot of our families currently are able to FaceTime, Skype, have that real-time visual connection. Even though that's awesome to have, what typically happens for a family is that you put your best self out there for those phone calls. A big reason is that, you don't have a lot of time to talk. And so you're trying not to get into major arguments, but really you're just trying to make the most of those short conversations. And so we tend to put on our best selves instead of dealing with the nitty gritty of life. And you can imagine over the course of any duration of a deployment, there's a natural disconnect that can happen with a couple when you're only sharing the highlights of your day, really only sharing the highlights of your week, and really not sharing the day-to-day nitty-gritty, often difficult experiences that you've gone through. Now, Matt and I did a great job during that deployment, really talking through some of those difficult details during a deployment because we had decided in advance that we could handle that. But by the end of the deployment for me, raising 2 toddlers, a 5-year-old and a toddler, I was really pushed to the limits as a woman and as a military spouse and as a mom on days that were difficult and pushing through being kind of that single parent and experiencing for myself how to push through no matter what, and really being stretched farther than I'd ever been stretched before. At times I felt like I was going to break, and then I wouldn't, and then I'd wake up the next day to do it all over again. And by the end of that year, what Matt came home to was a very independent, very confident, and a very strong person. Because I had, by the end, nailed down our battle rhythm and our schedule and our routine and a structure that worked for me. Whereas when he left, I remember that day that he left, and I didn't think I could even get the kids to McDonald's and back without breaking down. So huge difference between when he had left and when he came back. Mm-hmm. So for you, I would say, what would you say would be some of the things that you changed and how you changed during the deployment?
Probably one of the biggest changes during the deployment was I went from being pretty rigid and pretty expecting things to be a certain way, and that was just always planning and always trying to make sure everything had a place and everything was in its place. Everything in its place and a place for everything. Mm-hmm. To when I came back, I was pretty much, kind of laissez-faire, kind of like however it happens is how it's going to happen. Very carpe diem. I appreciated all the little things that I probably glossed over initially, and some of that had to do with the fact that we had so many casualties and we were experiencing death and mortality at such a high rate on such a consistent basis that after a while you just grow to appreciate whatever's happening in that day, and you are fully present in that day and not really worried about the next thing. You're just enjoying whatever life has for you in that moment. But it was also really dependent on the fact that you could never really get a dependable ride on an aircraft because the helicopter pilots decide when they want to fly and where they want to fly and how they can fly. And so there were plenty of times where I was out visiting soldiers, getting stranded at a place and kind of going, well, the Afghans, the Islamic Afghans, have a phrase that they call inshallah, which means Allah wills it. And so everybody kind of adopts this idea of, it's inshallah, whatever happens, happens. And so we'll just be prepared for it whenever it does. And so at that point, coming home to a really strong-willed, in a wonderful way, in a great way, I was so glad that I was no longer like the only point person in the house that could make decisions. We did have kind of a head bumping after that, where we had both changed in so many drastic ways, in ways that we really needed to change, but we weren't prepared to begin to do life together according to those changes afterwards. But there was also, for me, it kind of still exists, what I term as a profound sadness that kind of lingers. During that deployment, I lost a good friend. We had 8 soldiers that were, 7 that were killed in action, and 1 that died of his wounds coming out of one battle. And then time after time, I was still seeing friends that were coming through with bullet wounds, shrapnel wounds, all kinds of different things, as well as we had 13 mass casualties with Afghan local nationals. And whether that was performing CPR and doing chest compressions on one of our interpreters, or performing CPR and doing chest compressions on a little 3-year-old Afghan child who had been playing with daddy's improvised explosive device. Those kind of things had left a mark and still do on me, as far as not just kind of being sad about certain things, but also it leads to a deep appreciation for life. I believe I hug my children much tighter because of those experiences. So it's not all negative. I know we talk about post-traumatic stress, but there's also post-traumatic growth. And so coming back, there's just a big basket full of stuff that you didn't really know what to do with yet. And life had to begin to play itself out. And we had gone to our own individual therapists afterwards. We had done an extensive, inordinate amount of talking between the two of us, as 2 therapists are
prone to do.
And so it's been an incredible growing experience. I think we've both grown for the better because of it. But I can say that all deployments are different. So what deployment looks like for me is not what deployment looks like for somebody else. Not just because of their job in the Army, but because of where they deployed to and what they're doing while they're deployed, as well as the kind of infrastructure they may have deployed. I was able to call Corie on a phone on a daily basis because I had a phone located in the back of my chapel. There were other places that not only didn't have a phone or a computer, but they didn't have a shower. And I know guys that didn't have a shower for 63 days. And so there are varying degrees of levels of separation. I was able to tell her where we were at, kind of what was going on and what my experiences were, because I was in the conventional Army. If you're in the unconventional military, special operations, she wouldn't know where we're at, what we're doing, when we're leaving, when we're coming home, any of that information, because it's all close held and it's all held secret or top secret. So as you're helping people, diving into their experience to get a level of awareness and understand life from their point of view, their perspective, and how they endured it. And it even goes to this idea for me that we can have the same kind of deployment experience as other people, but those other people aren't us, and so therefore they're going to react to it completely different. This sounds obvious, but even we can default into a mode of thinking that we automatically understand somebody's perspective and experience because we're a military family, because we're an Army family, we're a chaplain family, we're helping other people out, we've lived through it. But what's happening nowadays is very different than what happened 6, 7, maybe even 2 or 3 years ago, because it's constantly changing, constantly in flux. So there's a constant need to know, what does the world look like, and how are people experiencing that when they go downrange, what we call deployment downrange, as a part of national security and defense.
So a couple of things that I think that we're finding at least as trends in the military family culture that you can expect is that a lot of service members who have especially gone on a deployment tend to, like Matt said, come home with a carpe diem mentality, this live life to its fullest. Some of them because they were in high adrenaline situations, some of them because they lost somebody important to them, some of them just because maybe it was a boring deployment, but they were away from family and now they've come home and they really want to engage with family. But it's kind of this carpe diem, live life to the fullest mentality. And what you typically have on the military spouse side, what I like to call the supporting spouse at home, is that they have had to learn how to wrestle life to the ground and control it as much as possible to keep their sanity. And a lot of the attention tends to fall on the veteran, on the military member, on the service member. And even within the military culture, a lot of attention tends to go to their side in order to make sure that they are coming home and reintegrating okay and getting the training that they need and they're fit for duty. And so just to quickly give you an inside perspective into the spouse world is that this is something that we accept, that it tends to revolve around the service member. But deep down inside, military spouses are really, especially nowadays, really struggling with that. We deeply love and feel just as patriotic about what we get to do and how we get to serve. But military spouses tend to have their life revolve, the family revolves around the service member's schedule, the service member's assignments, the service member's whatever the spontaneous needs might be, especially if you're in a special ops community. And so military spouses typically won't complain very much about that. In fact, if you were to ask a military spouse how do they feel about that, they may not even know themselves, because they are so much of caregivers of the home and managing the home and taking care of the kids. They don't often take a moment to think about how they do feel. And if they have thought about it, and there's a lot of that resentment that's built up over time because they've not had good self-care, or because they maybe feel like they haven't gotten some of the respite that they need, tend to have resentment under the surface or bitterness under the surface that most of them are going to have a hard time expressing because it comes across so unpatriotic. So I find that when I talk with military spouses, that they will either not know how they feel or are not likely to share how they feel, especially in front of their service member, because they're not wanting to come across as complaining or as if they don't appreciate the lifestyle that we actually live in. My point here is that during reintegration, you have two worlds, two very different people who've been changed in very dramatic ways sometimes, who've missed really important big events, even if it was a shorter deployment. A spouse has missed, a father perhaps has missed something with the kids or whatever, but you've missed some key things that have gone on in your relationship and in the family home. And then they're coming together and trying to figure out how to find this new normal, this new pattern, when you've got a spouse that's wrestled life into submission and controlling as much as possible, and you've got the service member who really wants to be spontaneous and eat whatever they want to eat because they have more options than they did before, to live life to the fullest, some of them wanting to do that adrenaline seeking because they're used to that. It's just two very different climates. So I think for us coming home, I think that our reintegration was challenging definitely in those ways. Mm-hmm. Our kids definitely had to establish a new normal with us as well. We often share the story that during the deployment before Matt left, the kids loved blueberries and they loved blueberry pancakes. And that was something that Matt has always loved to do on Saturday mornings, is make the kids breakfast. And of course, the first morning that we woke up, he wanted to serve me by letting me sleep in and wake up early and make breakfast for the boys, only to find out, because I hadn't told him, that the boys had changed their minds during the deployment and didn't like blueberry pancakes anymore. And you can imagine what that was like for him to, be so excited to do this, only to find out the kids are running down the stairs going, "Ew, blueberry pancakes, we don't like blueberry pancakes," and what that can feel like. And so one of the things that you often share with service members, especially during reintegration, is talking about, or actually with couples, not just service members, is the importance of having a list. Mm-hmm. So I forgot what you call that in the military when you're asking.
It's called debriefing somebody.
Yeah, so that was something that you told me. So Why don't you share with everybody what you told me about the importance of having a debriefing?
You live your life so much that you forget that other people don't live your life, and they don't know what's going on and how things have changed on a day-to-day basis. So even just the simplicity of hey, who are the kids' new friends, and what are their names, and where do they live, and what do we know about their parents, and what are their favorite games to play, and what do they still love Pokemon? Are they into Voltron, or is it Transformers, or Indiana Jones, or Star Wars? What's their love language right now? What do they lack? What do they need? Where are they succeeding? Where are they failing? Oftentimes, most of the times, for military families, the service member is periphery to the nucleus of the spouse and the kids. Right, wrong, or indifferent. whether or not it's deployment or training, we're so coming and going out of the house, if we're working 60, 80 hours a week, that by the time we come home, we realize that our spouse is basically running the entire house. They're dad and mom and dad, and best friend, and budgeter, financier, all the different things that you would like to be. And so when you come into the house, you're actually trying to figure out, where do I plug in? So debriefing kind of helps somebody go, okay, here's where you can plug in. Here's what works parenting wise, and here's what doesn't. And I also think that it's important for the service member to understand what's different about their own life and what's changed and what they need, and to be able to paint an accurate picture of that. I don't like the rest of the movie, but in the movie The Hurt Locker, there's a great scene where a service member is actually in an aisle of a grocery store trying to shop for cereal. And it was the only part of the movie that I think I actually saw and remember, but I remember being overwhelmed by a couple of things. It was the options, just the massive amount of options. And it's not because it's like some great grocery store. It's because you don't have options downrange. I mean, your options come forward in a care package that somebody chose for you. And you eat at prescribed times. And whether or not that's in a dining facility where it's only open from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock, and whatever they make is whatever you're eating that day. And then it could be the biggest choice you could get for food could be at lunchtime, when you're looking at a box of MREs, meals ready to eat, and you know what the main entree is in there because it's written on the front. You may be choosing between the lesser of two evils that you don't like, and hoping that one has Skittles or M&Ms or peanut butter something in there. So you can be overwhelmed by options. I know we had a note on there to talk about triggers, but even just the smells. I remember getting off the plane in Dallas and smelling perfume, and I didn't see anybody wearing perfume that could have been wearing perfume within 20, 30 feet. But it had been a year since I smelled perfume. And so it was pungent. It was a heavy aroma. So even just something as having candles burning in the house can smell good, but one candle could probably be overwhelming because their nose has gotten used to other smells. The colors that are out there. I talked about it with cereal, but you don't see like pinks and purples and yellows and bright greens and bright blues and all those extra colors. You see tan, other versions of tan, darker tan that some people call brown. You see dirt, other colors of dirt, gray when it comes to rocks, and then green occasionally, depending on where you're at. But usually it's a version of tan. So when your world is completely beige for, months on end, and you start to see color, it can literally be mentally overwhelming. It can be overstimulating. And the last thing is, and you didn't notice this until you were wondering about where the safety rails were on the aircraft carrier, is that if you're not around kids for a solid year, you're not worried about anybody else's, you're not worried about the little needs and the little safety of children. I mean, you're worried about your own safety and the safety of the people that you're serving with, but most of those people have a weapon and they're also kind of watching out for one another. But little kids obviously have needs that you have not been attempting to attend to for months and months on end. So to give you it can be difficult.
Yeah, to give you an example of that, we were talking about Army specific, but when I had the opportunity to go on an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf, on the ocean, it really was startling to me as a military spouse who's constantly thinking about children and children's safety, and that's kind of my world, to go on this aircraft carrier and to see these places on the ship that were completely just not roped off, like just a ledge going straight off the ship into the ocean, and wondering where's a chain, where's the gate, where's isn't any even an adult gonna fall out, and suddenly they're missing. And so just this unnerving feeling that and I turned to a service member on that ship, a Navy sailor on that ship, and just was why isn't there chains up? And he nodded his head. He was like, there are no children running around on the Air Force carrier. You are just really adulting, if you will. So it really opened my eyes to, I hear so often service members coming home and the spouse is being frustrated because they're not attentive to what that toddler needs or what the child needs because they haven't been in the world of thinking about those little extra things of safety for the duration of their deployment. So I know a lot of you are going to be working with these families in different settings and at different stages of their military career. And so you might come across some military families where this is a brand new experience, their first reintegration. And so a couple of tips that a lot of military families are very familiar with, but perhaps these tips would be helpful for you or especially to a new military family going through reintegration. Things like he was saying, paying attention to the five senses and thinking about what could be overwhelming to that service member coming home. We always caution to not have balloons to welcome home a service member because balloons can pop in the car, that can pop at your event if you're doing a workshop and you wanted to have balloons, and that can trigger or trigger a startle response for service members especially. There are other triggers like loud sounds, like Matt mentioned, the sensory issue of the candles and things like that. So really, it's not about having kid gloves with everybody per se, but it's just about being attentive. And maybe in your workshops, even having a conversation with everyone there of what are the things that are overwhelming to them right now? What would they like to kind of be aware of or stay away from that would be helpful?
Yeah, something that I've had to describe to my family often is that service members are overly trained to be hyper vigilant all the time. And it's a means of safety for self, security within the unit, within the organization. So when we talk about triggers, and you hear from veterans a lot, they just don't like to be out in crowds. It's not because they don't like people. It's because they are so highly attuned to the environment around themselves. They are pulling in massive amounts of information. And the way that I kind of describe it is, imagine that you're sitting in the middle of a room full of TVs and they're all on loud and they're all saying something different. And people are, in your mind, you feel as though you need to be aware of what's happening on every single TV. After a while, being in that room becomes very anxiety producing because you can't just tune out everything else and focus on one thing. And so when your body is trained to do that over time, it's called hyperarousal. When it's trained to be hyper aroused and hyper vigilant in the world around itself, and you get introduced into a place that is seemingly chaotic to yourself, then it can be overwhelming. We were at Disney and I was at the Lego store and I'm trying to be great dad and I'm sitting in the middle of the Lego store and I love Legos and I love the way that my boys get excited about Legos. But it's Disney and it's a Lego store and there are tired parents that are not supervising their kids who are running around everywhere and screaming, and all of a sudden I could just feel every bit of energy that was going on there, and it just felt like all the energy from the entire room was just going straight into me. And so I looked at Corie and I looked at the boys. I said, I got to go outside. So I went outside, closed my eyes, just focused on grounding myself, sitting on the ground, smelling the smells, making sure that I had my back towards something. So I was cutting off as much information as possible so that my amygdala, my hypothalamus, everything was trying to ratchet down. I was trying to bring down the amount of information that was flowing into me so that I wasn't having some overly anxious response in all of it. So it just kind of explains why it may not be what happens on the deployment. Service members are simply trained to be hypervigilant about everything and about everyone because it's a means of security. You don't want to get caught flat-footed. You don't want to get caught off guard. Mm-hmm. And so that's why service members most times love quiet, wide, open, empty spaces. Mm-hmm. Because there's nobody to pay attention to. When you have standoff, you can look around you and go, I'm safe, I'm secure, I can relax.
That brings up actually a really great point about reintegration, because a lot of families, now that they're back together, are going to want to take those vacations, and you've got external family members that are, definitely wanting to visit and see everybody for the first time, and it can be overwhelming to the family and to the service member. And so reviewing those topics on how to set good, healthy boundaries and communicate boundaries with external family members if you need to. A lot of families want to go on those trips. And so giving those families, those couples, an opportunity to talk through together what would a good vacation feel like. And that if you are going to attempt something like Disney, for those couples to talk through, I always ask couples to come up with a physical cue for each other. Doesn't even have to be verbal, because sometimes for those that have experienced extreme trauma or they do struggle with PTSD, may not be able to verbally say something in that moment of being triggered and overwhelmed. And so being able to have that physical cue where that person can kind of tap on a knee or a shoulder or squeeze a hand that just says, hey, I need to get out of here and I might even need your help to do it. Gives each other that opportunity to say, this is overwhelming, and I don't have to, sometimes pushing through those experiences like at the Lego store and saying, I'm not going to go take care of myself, I'm going to push through it, can actually magnify it and make it worse. And so being able to have, that was a great day and a great moment for Matt and I, because we were able to tend to each other, where I was able to give him, hey, you have that permission, go, it's okay. It doesn't say anything about you as what kind of father you are for you to go take care of yourself. I've got the kids and I'm having a great time. I'm not overwhelmed. And so being able to give each other that permission, and that spouses are going to need that too. So that physical cue is so important for any couple, even if they're not a service couple, to be able to have those tag team moments to say, I'm overwhelmed, I need your help, what can you do for me now to get me out of that situation?
And I acknowledge that spouses can have a level of resentment that things change within a service member that way. And so I know that my wife and both my boys, they acknowledge that I've changed because I've been in the military. But more than anything, I think this is just a thing with first responders and military. And I think it's always there, and maybe it just lies dormant until they actually begin to engage in it. They function on a different level with hypervigilance and hyperarousal, and they naturally gravitate towards places where it works for them. I mean, you're not going to find somebody that succeeds well at being law enforcement or being, a service member going to work in a library and really enjoying that until maybe retirement, when they can finally just go and be at peace and at ease. But it's just kind of the makeup of the person. And the more that we can actually get to a place and go, not just acceptance, but when we talk about the new normal, how can we make this work for us, and how can this actually be a good thing? Because there are times when I am the one that slows the entire family down, mainly because I want it to slow down, and I want it calm, and I want it relaxed, and I don't want to be going all the time. But what I see is after I make that slow down and get everybody to kind of slow down, everybody else kind of slows themselves down, and I think life actually becomes a little bit better for all of us when we realize we don't have to constantly be going and entertaining ourselves and doing those things.
And military spouses definitely do that, because we get into the habit of this, the busier you are, either the faster, the smoother the deployment, because you're really glossing over and denying those dead spaces, right? Because when you have those idle times, you're sitting there and you're worrying about your spouse. You're sitting there and experiencing what this deployment really is and what it means. And so military spouses can really find themselves habitually in this place of staying busy all the time, because it makes time move faster, and then your deployment is over faster as well. So another thing that we like to touch on is what we noticed about a level of holistic care that was really important to us in our story that we share with other military families, without getting into like the big details of the science behind it. We all know that hormones are all interconnected, and they impact how we feel and how we think and how we physically feel as well. And so Matt and I think halfway through the reintegration or so, really started to notice that we were not physically recovering from the level of stress that we had gone through. I know we were both fatigued, actually. So really struggling with fatigue, really struggling with irritability. And a lot of those signs typically look like PTSD, and they can be PTSD, but they can also be mistakenly diagnosed as PTSD when really it could be a hormonal imbalance or depletion in certain hormones, specifically cortisol in our case, where we had been through so much stress individually, and then coming home to the reintegration together, going through so much stress, that your adrenal gland that normally fires off that adrenaline that helps you cope with stressful situations was depleted and exhausted, and there was really no more of that adrenaline hormone or chemical to go through our bodies to help us deal with that stress.
Right, and there's an article written by a guy named Charles Wilkinson in conjunction with a VA out in Seattle where he talks about the prevalence or the comorbidity of hypopituitarianism with mild traumatic brain injury, and that it does mimic the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and it does exacerbate the symptoms of traumatic brain injury. And all that simply is that the body's been functioning at such a high level, the adrenal glands have been like overtaxed, as well as having some sort of rattle within the brain, and that could just be, you know, bumping the head. That could be a vehicle rollover where your helmet smacks against the side of a vehicle, where it may jar something inside the brain. And there you can test, you can read more about the article about what is actually tested for within the blood tests to be able to see where the service member is at that point. One thing to be aware of is that service members up until retirement are usually not fully truthful with all the things that have happened with themselves physically. And one of the reasons is that they don't want to lose their job. They've been afraid for the longest time. If I say that this happened or that happened, that I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to be non-deployable. If I was around a loud bang, if I was in a concussive blast. So oftentimes they answer no to questions that they probably should answer yes to. And so they need to be larger advocates for their own care, I guess.
And military spouses, especially if they have young children at home, just kind of chalk up the exhaustion and fatigue to just mothering small children, and that's just a season of life. And so really what we found was that we went and had our hormones checked. We asked for a good blood panel done where it measures cortisol, measures all the hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, all of those, and really asking a doctor to take a look at those detailed levels, specifically that cortisol as it relates to the adrenal fatigue. Mm-hmm. And so we actually ask a lot of our military families and first responder families, actually, not just the serving spouse, the supporting spouse as well, to go get those levels checked, because and you also have to encourage them to be an advocate for their own care, because usually what will happen in that blood work results is it will come back in a range based off of their age, and they might be within that healthy range, but that doesn't necessarily mean they feel well. Mm-hmm. And so there are simple over-the-counter, you can get it at GNC, Vitamin World, some adrenal support supplements that you can get even over-the-counter to replenish that cortisol level, replenish that adrenal gland, that can do wonders to make them less irritable, less fatigued. Yeah. It also, when we have low cortisol, it affects our weight gain as well. And so there's just a lot of things that they can do that are over the counter. So our encouragement to you is to encourage them to consider and getting a good physical workup when they come home.
Yeah, and definitely under the care of a physician.
Yes.
Not self-medicating with anything that they can get off the counter without knowing it, and with the last thing it is, some people know enough to just be dangerous. Yeah. And so making sure that they go and that they're honest and truthful with the physician.
Yes, so especially for service members who are always being screened, and we don't want to have them take anything that could get them into trouble, and they didn't know about that. So a couple of things. Is there anything else that we would want to say about kids and how they can encourage kids during a reintegration besides the debriefing?
Kids can function in a very, healing and innocent way for service members. There's a section of a book that I normally read for veterans. It's by Eric Maria Remarque. He wrote it called The Long Road Home. He's a World War I veteran, but I won't go into it now. But the whole gist of that section is him after war going back to be a teacher at what I presume to be an elementary school. And in his head, the section is talking about all the things that are rolling through his head as he's considering standing in front of the kids and talking to them and being able to teach them. And without spoiling it, it gets to the point where he realizes that there isn't much in him that he feels like he wants to tell the kids, that he needs to teach the kids. And that if he was going to teach them about anything that he really knows about, that he's experienced, it would be spoiling their innocence. And he goes, how then must I presume to teach you? Must I not become a child again myself? So joining children in their play, in their innocent world, in their joy and their laughter, can be a huge healing place for service members, and it has to be in a well-controlled environment. I wouldn't say, go to Showbiz Pizza and go have fun, but having that place and that space where they can enter again into being kids. And I would probably even say that would be valid for the spouse as well, who's had to be two parents and had to be overly responsible in that role, and probably hasn't had an opportunity for them to enjoy life similarly. So we all know that kids are great and can add a lot of fun and seasoning to life, but I think there's a key role they play for adults, especially adults that have had to do a lot of adulting, and that's to add, sorry, need a little coffee. That's to add some innocence and joy back into their life.
So a couple things that are a little bit different from our experience that was a few years ago that you might come across, just to go through these really quickly. Like Matt mentioned before, you have special ops and not just special forces that are having a faster tempo, shorter deployments. Deployments are a little bit shorter than they were before. When we came in, they were 12 months to 15 months, and now they're shorter. Sometimes they're 6 to 9 months, and then your special ops, special forces are 2 weeks, a month, 3 months, something like that, and they're always changing. Also that when we went through deployments, the entire neighborhood seemed like it was deploying all at once, like every big chunks, big brigades all at once, one big lump going off to deployment. And then our second deployment really marked what had changed since then, which was really these mutants and Legos going separately. And so you have onesies and twosies, or just like a few going at different times. And that really challenges the level of support, I think, especially back at home, the level of support that they might have when their neighbor isn't going through the same thing that they're going through. And so they're less likely to reach out to their neighbor for help because we are not sharing in that struggle together, which was what our first deployment was like, when we all kind of grouped up and kind of worked as a village to get through a deployment. So that's a whole other level of support. Anything else that you would add that's changed?
The timelines. We used to have what we would call the R4 Gen cycle. Don't worry about it. It's just a word, the R4 Gen cycle. But you would know, okay, I got a year on, I got a year off, I got a year on, I got a year off. When I'm off that year, I'm going to be doing a level of training. So I know I basically have about 4 to 5 months to actually kind of be at home and enjoy life, which is, I go to work and I come home at regular hours. And regular hours are usually 6:30 in the morning to about 5 p.m. in the evening. So they're long days and they're busy days. And now we're at a place where people can be called up for deployment within 30 to 60 day windows, or even shorter, depending on where they're at and where they serve. And so when we talk about being downrange, there's a hypervigilance for what are the threats in my local environment. When we talk about hypervigilance as far as an operational tempo, it is, like we say, it can all change in a lunch hour. In one lunch hour, I can go to work and then I can come home and go, oh, wow. So we're leaving in a month and we're going to be gone for 9 months. So let's get everything ready and let's prepare to go. And it can happen that way. It literally can. So one thing I tell anybody that wants to understand the military is to read the headline articles on military.com. Read the article. I mean, if you want to invest in the military, you have to know what's going on globally and not be surprised about it. I tell people, read the news from BBC, read the news from Al Jazeera, because those are two worldwide media outlets that let you know this is what's going on. For service members, we are hyper aware of everything that's going on usually in the world. If they're a leader, they're constantly aware of where the world's changing and what's shifting and what is being shaped and who likes who now and who doesn't like who and what just happened with an election in this certain place in this certain country. And so depending on their level of awareness, they may be sitting in a level of anxiety that they're not even telling their spouse about, because in the back of their head, they're just trying to not get caught off guard by the next plan. So helping service members really is understanding their world in that respect.
And likewise, I think for spouses who are constantly thrown by new ideas, thrown by new plans, that adds a level of stress as well. Just very briefly, National Guard and Reserves, I traditionally used to think that they were kind of just settled into their communities and maybe just drilling on the weekends. And I think we're seeing a ramp up of reserves even being deployed more than usual. And so a lot of our families that are in the civilian community, not necessarily active duty and being moved all over the place and constantly relocating, but a lot of our military families that are in the civilian communities are still going through a lot of the challenges that the active duty families are going through, and do not have the level of support that active duty families do when they live on an installation or live close to an installation. And so being mindful and asking in your workshops, who is National Guard, who is reserves, who's active duty, because those reserve families especially would really love to connect with those active duty families or another military family that's there in the room to have a level of support that they cannot find in the civilian world. And so we're seeing a lot of those differences start to kind of blend into having more similarities.
And one of the timelines that's different for the Guard and the Reserve, for active duty, it could be a 9 to 12 month deployment, which literally means from the day to day, door to door, it's 9 to 12 months. For the Guard and Reserve, it can be upwards of 15 to maybe 18 months even, because they do a pre-deployment training that they leave their home, they go to a different place and do a training for 2 to 4 months, anywhere in that range. And then they do their full-on deployment, and then they do what's called a demobilization. So, I mean, when you're talking about it, that deployment can last, 12 to 18 months from when they actually leave their house to when they get back. So their deployments are that much longer in respect.
There's a lot of military families that would say that their experience in their marriage has been half together and half apart when you add all of that time up together. And so just being mindful that as you're helping these families through reintegration, that they are establishing a new normal, and that this is a difficult time, that they desperately want to reconnect with their spouse and with their family members. And at the same time, they also have these kind of different worlds that they have to navigate too. And how do we reconnect and appreciate each other and serve each other and respect each other's world, and at the same time have a world together? So I think to wrap up our time, I really think that it would be good that Matt and I can maybe share with you some inside ways of how you can establish rapport very quickly with military families. Some things to keep in mind that really matter to the inside world of military families when you're establishing that rapport. For those of you who don't have a lot of experience with military, maybe don't have any military members in your family line or know of anybody that's ever deployed, I imagine it can be a little bit overwhelming and daunting to approach some military families. And so we'd like to give you just a couple of tips of some things that you can do or say that would really establish that rapport very quickly. And so to start off, I think I would just say that be authentic, be real. And it's okay that you don't know all the lingo and all the acronyms. It's okay that you don't understand from your own personal experience everything that they've gone through. That military families value very deeply in a wonderful, beautiful way, which is one of my favorite things to do in serving military families, is they love authenticity. And they're very real people. And so being able to just introduce yourself, to be transparent, to share without bleeding, obviously, a little bit of your own story, a little bit of your reason of why you're leading a workshop, why you're there to serve them, that will capture their interest in their heart very quickly, because they discern very quickly who is authentic and who isn't.
Yes, being authentic, being vulnerable, but not fully expecting the service member, especially for their vulnerability as well. And I would say it would probably even still be true for the spouse. When you're talking to a commander, which you wouldn't be doing, but if I'm a service member, I'm talking to the commander, one of their first questions is, what are my vulnerabilities? And when they use that term vulnerabilities, they're meaning, what are the things that I have to avoid? I do not want to make myself vulnerable, because that leads to risk and that leads to people getting hurt. They're not talking about their emotional vulnerabilities, but that word becomes a negative word. It becomes something you want to avoid. So what I see is it's only usually for people that have retired or transitioned out that they begin to talk about all their vulnerabilities, all the things that are going on inside them, where they begin to kind of crack the safe open a little bit and begin to show a little bit of what's been going on inside them. And they're just now beginning to try and unpack 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years worth of hard times, as well as go, if for 20 years they've only been with their spouse they've been married for 20 years, they've been in the Army 20 years, and they've only been with their spouse for 10 years. They're sitting there going, so who am I married to? And that spouse is going, who am I married to? And how are we going to make this work? And they've both been changing over time, but that's also been punctuated by many honeymoon periods of coming and going from field trainings all the way to deployments. And so after that amount of time, they're really trying to figure out, what do I like? What do I think about? I talked to one service member last week. He did not know what his spouse's favorite color was. He'd been married 27 years, been in the military 28, and he had just now figured out their favorite color was purple. And so he went out and bought a purple shirt. But he didn't know that until he was actually looking at a closet trying to figure out, what kind of clothes does my spouse like? I don't know. I've been busy. I've been so busy with my job and trying to take care of the family and do all these sort of things. They didn't even know. So there's a whole lot of stuff they're not aware of that they need somebody to kind of handhold them and walk them through. The good thing is, though, is they have some very deep-seated values. For the Army, we have loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. So you can lean on any one of those values. That is a vocabulary they know how to speak and they know how to relate. So when you talk about being loyal in the marriage, when you talk about what just things you do by duty, for us specifically, one of the ways that I try and be nice and be kind is to perform duty around the house. Like, it's my duty to pick up and to put things in the laundry and to move it through and to fold laundry and to do the dishes and to clean the house. Those are things that I accept as duty. And I do that in order to show her my loyalty around the house. And so you can really capitalize on things that they're already kind of trained to do. I call it Karate Kid style of life. You know, the things that make you a good service member over here also can make you a good spouse, and vice versa. So
I think also, as I always try to keep in mind, balancing the scales between the serving spouse and the supporting spouse. Again, it's very easy to kind of lean towards the service member because they've had these really, different, amazing experiences. Even if they had a boring deployment, if they went to somewhere in the world that we've never been, it can be very enticing to go to lean towards the serving spouse's experience, while the supporting spouse, the military spouse, is kind of stuck with the whole workshop or conversation is centered around that serving spouse. So I always keep in the back of my mind, how do I keep the scales balanced? So if we spend a good amount of time talking to the service member, how do I balance the scales and bring it back to the spouse? We recently did a retreat over this last weekend and separated the service members from the spouses and gave them a chance to actually just sit in their own experience for a little while. And I'm not necessarily saying that you should do that, but what we got as far as feedback is how important and wonderful that was for them, especially the spouses, because they had not had a chance to talk about their experiences. And they have just kind of accepted over time that it's going to be all about the service member. So just being mindful to keep those scales balanced, and you will earn the love and respect of that military spouse as well if they feel seen and heard and feel like they're part of the conversation.
And that actually plays out really good for the service member because they're really tired of getting all the attention. I mean, just in the sense of like whether or not they feel like they're constantly the problem, or we got to figure them out, or what do we need to do to help them, or what. I mean, many service members, myself included, we're just trying to get on with life. You're just trying to go, okay, well, here's the new normal. Let's just get on with life, and let's just not act like there's no problem, but to go, okay, so what is it that you need? Because the rest of the world is trying to throw things at me as a service member, and I don't see them trying to throw things your way and take care of you. And I'd really like some of that help because I can't be the sole provider for your well-being and your welfare. So yeah, it does gladden my heart when people are like, let's take care of military spouses. And you're like, okay, cool. It's not that I can take a back seat and not do that anymore. It's literally going, I just want to act like nothing big changed about me, or that I'm totally okay, and you get all the attention and you have fun.
Yeah, and I think the last thing that I would just say is that these military families typically, not all the time, but typically are very strong people. They've been through very difficult circumstances, in some cases, some high levels of suffering. And although they may come across as super strong, they're very tender on the inside. And it's normal for them to kind of approach a workshop like this, and it might if you're presenting to them, it might come across that they're being strong or guarded, and they probably are, but that doesn't mean that they're not taking in what you're saying. And so just being patient with the process, the more you invest in them and show that you see them, that you're interested in their world, that you care about them, the more they may open up over time. But even if they don't, to recognize that they really value the fact that you're offering this to them and that you see them, and that's what they're going to walk away with more than anything else. And you're probably going to likely have side conversations more than you're going to have conversations as a group, because you never know what rank is in the room. And so some people aren't going to open up about certain things in a large group setting, but are likely to have side conversations or they're more private conversations on the side. Mm-hmm. So I think the last thing that I just want to say is we often get a question about dual service couples. And I think the really only big thing to keep in mind, because we've said a lot of spouse and service member, and is that when you have two service members that are married, there is a whole other dynamic. They do definitely sit in the role of spouse and service member, but they can flip-flop that too. And so just to be aware that that does add a different dynamic if that's in the room. In those circumstances, we've heard from couples that they very much understand each other's deployment experience. And that's a really cool thing, that they get to understand each other. They get to understand why they enjoy deploying and the difficulties of coming home, like Matt described. But that their dynamic in their marriage is difficult, and that as they go up through the ranks, as they're promoted, we've seen a lot of couples over time really struggle with, at some point, is one going to have to drop off if they have a family, or as one career surges and the other may not, that can add a whole other dynamic. Anything that else you want to say about that?
No, but that sometimes they can default into, if they're both acting like service members, then their marriage may become less about the emotionality or the emotional connectedness of it, and they may just default to kind of making things happen, which is what service members are well known to be. Yeah, very much execute. What's the next thing that needs to happen? What's the next thing that needs to happen? And they can avoid the emotional tenderness and the connectedness that needs to occur there.
So we just want to thank you for what you do. Thank you for your willingness to serve military families. It's our favorite thing to do. It's our calling to be a military family and to serve military families. If you want to learn more about our story, I wrote the book Sacred Spaces that shares a lot more about our experience as a couple, our experience through deployment and reintegration, as well as what personally changed in me when I finally had a chance to go overseas and see deployment conditions, and how that helped me understand his world so much better, and actually vice versa, because it was kind of a role reversal opportunity. And so you can get that on Amazon, and you can also get that from my website as well. But more than anything, we just want to thank you for your willingness to serve, and we're here to support you anytime you need it. So thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.